Everybody, this is Perch. I want to play devil's advocate for a minute and just lay out half of a case. I don't think that this is the definitive answer. I don't think nobody should take this as 100%. This is the truth. I think that this is an opinion, and I'm going to kind of argue it from one side, and I want to acknowledge up front, you can argue it from the other direction. So one of the things that's, I think, I don't know, plagued or been said, particularly about the big two, is that they are in desperate need of a reboot. And people say things like, you can't expect these characters, being Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, etc. You can't expect them to continue to be popular for decades after decades after decades. They need to be retired at some point or rebooted, or you can't have this constant ongoing shared universe. And so I want to, it's an interesting argument for me. And the reason is because one of the things I love about comics is the idea of a shared universe. And it's one of the reasons why so many videos I do talk about Marvel and DC. It's not because I'm a Marvel or DC shill. My favorite comics, especially if we're including European and manga in there as well, are definitely not from Marvel and DC. My absolute favorite books are from other publishers. I've referenced before, just as one example of many. I've talked about Rumiko Takahashi's work. I've talked about Midnight Nation. There's tons of titles. Even the fondest I have for a book like Zot, which is this almost nobody's heard of. But definitely Marvel and DC are not my favorites. But Marvel and DC are the torchbearers for this idea of this ongoing shared universe that doesn't end. And if you think about manga, you think about certainly European comics, different spaces, and indie comics. One thing that there is in common is that there usually is an ending point. Now, they don't all happen in the same way. Something like a Dragon Ball Z will go far, far longer than Alice in Borderland. There's huge differences in how long a title is written, but I would maintain that with a few exceptions, and there definitely are a few exceptions, most indie titles, manga, and even European, even stuff like Asterix or Tintin, the stories are written with an end in mind, with a destination point. Now, sometimes the stories get, there's a new tale in the story. Sometimes there's different things that happen. But generally speaking, these stories are written like maybe more traditional books. Even, whether it's something like a standalone title, 1984, or something like Harry Potter, where you have multiple books in the series, there still is a, beginning, middle, and end to the story. And one of the, I think, great things, and at the same time, fatal flaws that Marvel and DC have, is that their stories go on indefinitely. I think that so that's the kind of the premise and the argument I want to make here, is that I do think Marvel would benefit, given who's working in that company right now, and I know there's a very polarized view on this. They would benefit from a hard reboot, a hard reset of their stories. The challenge is, and why even saying that, I hate it, is that the past and the history is very, very valuable to me, number one, so I don't like the idea of dumping it. Number two, I believe that the companies would take the opportunity of a hard reset to, tweak and modify around core aspects of the characters for no apparent reason other than to align to whatever fads are going on in the current year. This is a little bit of a tricky one to explain, but there are various trends that happen and different ways people look at social topics. And I think one of the cool parts about Marvel's legacy is that you can look to the 70s and to the 80s in the X-Men, and you can get some commentary on social issues. Now, I do think the X-Men, and I maintain this from before, I think the X-Men is in many ways a flawed way to draw parallels between racism. I know they do it, but I think that there's some aspects to it that make that analogy pretty flawed. But that said, I think that there's a certain level of timelessness to a lot of the ways that these stories handled some of these topics. And one of the complaints I have, and I suspect others, although they don't voice it this way, have is that current comics that are coming out in the last 5 years or so, are they're too tied to events that are happening right now, and they build the whole story around that. And I think they do that to their detriment. There are, like, for example, I hope not, but the Marvel and DC shouldn't write a bunch of storylines based around kind of COVID protocols and things that are going on. Because in 10 years, the world will look much different. Those stories will age badly, and it will set the company up for, a lot of awkward, cringy moments. So if Marvel or DC did a hard reboot and reset, my fear is that they would alter characters, they would change things around, they would race swap and gender swap, and they would do all that kind of stuff. Not to create a long lasting legacy, but to try and tap into what's going on in the news right now. And I think that would be a flaw. Now, for what it's worth, yes, in the past, characters were obviously created to tap into sensibilities in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s and the 60s, for sure. But one of the benefits to it going on for decades and decades is the writers ultimately have to move past whatever the original origin point, whatever the original idea was for that character, to actually make them sustainable. They actually have to put in the work to make this character, go farther. And I think that's healthy. I think that's good. And I think that's something that, in many cases, we're not seeing much of today. Characters are created for, to reflect the Black Lives Matter protests. And so we get a character that's going to reflect that. And as as that news starts to die down, or as things start to change, the character is discarded and a new one is created just based on whatever the new trend is. And I think that's a difference, because I think back in the days, those characters couldn't just be discarded. I think by and large, a lot of them were, writers had to figure out new ways to make them relevant. It feels like we're not doing that as much anymore. But the other reason why I hate the idea, but I think it might be necessary, is that it feels like a cop out. I don't think that you have to reboot and restart the entire universe. I don't think that's necessary. I think a skilled writer, somebody who's got a good story and idea in their mind, I think they can come up with cool ideas. I think they can come up with ways to keep the character going. I think people have in the past. One of the interesting things about comics is that people say, well, it's probably time to retire. These characters have been around for decades, like Superman and Spider-Man and Batman. Except Batman is still selling quite well. I mean, even its sales in 2021 are higher than they were in 2004, and they're lower than what they were on the newsstand. But Batman sales are not the problem. Spider-Man sales are arguably not the problem. Yeah, it would be good if those titles sold more, but the biggest reason why they're not is not because the character is boring or because that's when they push. It's because you don't have the newsstand anymore. They're sold in fewer places. But when we're talking about these characters that are old-fashioned and people are just sick of them, like Spider-Man and Batman, you're out of your mind. Those characters are doing fine. They're leading the pack, and their sales are reasonable. Like, there's no emergency needed for Amazing Spider-Man and for Batman. The emergency is needed for characters like Captain America and Black Panther, probably, and Superman for sure, and Wonder Woman. Those titles are underselling where they should by a mile. Those titles need some help. But it's proven through Batman, through Spider-Man, through other characters, it's proven that it's not the age of the character. It's not the fact they've been around for a long time. It's that the stories that are being told are not capturing people's imagination. And in many cases, I think it feels like people are trying to have their cake and eat it too. They want to do a bold new take on a character, and they also want to have the leverage of using this existing property, and the resulting combination sucks. But in general, I feel like I've argued myself. I'm now arguing with myself. It's a crazy thing. So I'm curious to get your opinions on all this and your input. I think this comment of we need to reboot, we need to restart, we need to dump all this baggage, I think you could make an argument for it where Marvel and DC are concerned, specifically because I think indie comics, comics from overseas, they're doing a better job of telling a complete story. Whereas the big two feel often that they're just spinning their wheels. They're just keeping things moving for the sake of keeping it moving. And so that's the pro side. On the con side, I still believe that there's ways to tell a complete story. There's ways to make these characters feel fresh and exciting. And I think it's too much of a cop out to say, well, just because they're old, we don't have any more ideas. So, what do we do? But anyway, I put way too much on the board for this video. Like I said, I said I was going to argue one point. I kind of wound up arguing both, which sucks. Bad quality. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. What do you do? Is it time for a big reboot for these companies? Do you buy into the logic that, hey, Spider-Man's been around forever. He's had his run. We should dump him and bring in whatever the new flavor is. Is that necessary? Are you like me? Do you believe that's just a cop out? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe, of course, and thanks for listening.